Picture this. It's 3 a.m. A baby is screaming like the world is ending. You're exhausted, you have no idea what's wrong, and there's no white noise app, no pacifier, no pediatrician on speed dial, and definitely no stranger on the internet telling you to try lavender oil. Now take that exact same scene and drag it back 50,000 years. Same baby, same scream, same 3 a.m. Except now you're in a cave, or a hut, or huddled under some animal hides, and somewhere out there in the dark, something with teeth is listening. So the question isn't really what did ancient humans do when babies wouldn't stop crying? The real question is how did our species survive at all, given that crying babies are basically walking, screaming dinner bells for predators? And the answer is stranger, smarter, and honestly funnier than you'd expect. Let's start with the crying itself, because crying is not some design flaw evolution forgot to fix. It's a feature, a loud, obnoxious, impossible to ignore feature. A newborn's cry sits in a frequency range that's practically engineered to hijack the human brain. Researchers have found that it activates the same regions associated with pain and threat response. Your body doesn't experience a baby's cry as background noise. It experiences it as an alarm going off in your own skull. That's not an accident. Babies who cried loudly and persistently were more likely to get attention, food, warmth, and protection. Babies who cried quietly, or not at all, sometimes got missed. Harsh as it sounds, evolution rewarded the loud ones. But here's the catch that ancient parents had to deal with, and modern parents mostly don't. That same piercing cry that summons a caregiver also summons everything else with ears. A wolf, a hyena, a leopard with nothing better to do. For most of human history, a crying baby wasn't just an annoyance. It was a liability with lungs. So early humans couldn't just let a baby cry it out in the corner of the cave and hope for the best. Silence, or fast soothing, wasn't a parenting preference. It was survival math. So what did they actually do? First thing, they almost never put the baby down. I mean that almost literally. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Kung in the Kalahari, whose lifestyles give us the closest living window into how our ancestors probably lived, have found that infants in these communities are in near constant physical contact with a caregiver. Not occasional contact, constant. We're talking held, carried, or worn for the vast majority of daylight hours, often touching skin the whole time. Some studies estimate infants in these societies are held upwards of 90% of their waking hours in the first months of life. Compare that to modern Western infants who might spend a good chunk of the day in a crib, a bouncer, a car seat, or propped up staring at a mobile spinning slowly above them like some kind of tiny sedated astronaut. Ancient babies didn't get that alone time. They got body heat, they got heartbeat, and they got movement. And that movement mattered more than you'd think. Inside the womb, a fetus spends 9 months getting rocked, jostled, and lulled by the mother's own motion, walking, bending, breathing. The second a baby is born, all of that stops. Cold turkey. Suddenly there's no gentle sway, no muffled heartbeat, no warm walls. Just cold air, bright light, and gravity doing whatever it wants. It's basically the most abrupt change of address in a person's entire life. So when a newborn cries, in a lot of cases it's not because something is wrong. It's because something is different, and different feels terrifying when you've been on Earth for approximately 4 hours. Ancient caregivers figured out, probably through nothing more scientific than trial, error, and sheer desperation, that recreating those womb-like conditions worked. Rocking, swaying, bouncing, walking in slow circles at 2 a.m. until your legs feel like wet noodles. This wasn't written down in any parenting manual because there were no parenting manuals. It was passed down the same way fire starting and berry identification were passed down. Watch what the elders do, copy it, and don't ask too many questions. Which brings us to one of the most underrated inventions in human history, the baby carrier. Long before baby wearing became a hashtag with its own aesthetic, Ancient parents were strapping infants to their bodies using slings made of animal hide, woven plant fiber, or braided cordage. Archaeologists have found evidence, mostly indirect, through tools, bone wear patterns, and depictions in later art that suggests infant carrying devices go back tens of thousands of years. Some researchers even argue that carrying slings might be one of the earliest textile technologies humans ever developed, right up there with clothing itself. Think about that. Before humans figured out how to weave a proper blanket, they may have already figured out how to weave something to strap a screaming infant to their chest so they could keep foraging with both hands free. And honestly, the design logic checks out. A baby strapped to a moving adult gets constant motion, constant body warmth, constant heartbeat, and a front row seat to whatever the adult is doing, walking, gathering food, even fighting off the occasional territorial goat. From an evolutionary perspective, it's efficient. The baby stays calm and close, the parent stays productive, and nobody has to choose between watch the baby and find dinner. It's multitasking prehistoric style. Now let's talk about who was actually doing all this soothing, because here's a plot twist. It probably wasn't just mom. There's a concept in anthropology called cooperative breeding, popularized by primatologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, and it argues that humans are unusual among great apes because we evolved to raise children with a whole support network, not just two parents grinding it out solo. Chimpanzee mothers, for comparison, do almost everything themselves. Human mothers, throughout most of our history, had backup. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, friends, sometimes unrelated members of the group, all pitching in to hold, carry, feed, and soothe infants. Researchers call these helpers alloparents, which is a fancy word for the village, in It Takes a Village. Except in this case, the village is doing actual, documented, evolutionarily significant labor. This matters enormously for our crying baby investigation, because it means ancient infants weren't relying on one exhausted person's patience running on fumes. If mom needed 5 minutes to eat something, drink water, or just stare blankly at a wall in a state of shell-shocked exhaustion, someone else could step in and bounce the baby for a while. Multiple warm bodies meant multiple chances to catch and calm a meltdown before it spiraled. Some anthropologists argue this shared caregiving system is actually one of the reasons human infants can afford to be born so helpless in the first place. Human babies are famously underdeveloped at birth compared to other primates, unable to walk, barely able to hold their own heads up, essentially still finishing construction outside the womb. That's an incredibly risky strategy unless you've got backup, and we did. So if you've ever felt personally attacked by the idea that you, alone at 3 a.m., with a screaming infant and zero support, are somehow failing where ancient people managed just fine, here's your vindication. Ancient people did not, in fact, manage it alone. They had a whole crying baby response team. You're not doing it wrong. You're just doing it without the team. Now, movement and closeness handled a lot of the crying, but not all of it. Because sometimes a baby cries and nobody, ancient or modern, has the faintest idea why. And when ancient humans hit that wall of, I have tried everything and this child is still screaming, a lot of cultures didn't look for a physical explanation. They looked for a supernatural one. Take ancient Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamians had an entire demon dedicated specifically to tormenting infants. Her name was Lamashtu, and she was considered responsible for miscarriages, infant illness, and yes, inconsolable crying. Clay tablets and amulets from thousands of years ago contain incantations meant to ward her off. Magical formulas parents would recite, or wear, or hang near the cradle, hoping to keep her away. There were even amulets shaped with images meant to frighten Lamashtu off, because apparently the ancient solution to demon making my baby cry was summon a slightly scarier-looking demon to guard the door. It's like prehistoric home security, except instead of a camera doorbell, you've got a clay tablet covered in threats against a child-snatching she-demon. Ancient Egypt had its own protective figures. Bes, a dwarf god with a lion-like face and a permanently unimpressed expression, was considered a guardian of households, and especially of mothers and infants. Statues and amulets of Bes were kept near beds and cradles specifically to scare off evil spirits believed to cause nightmares, illness, and relentless crying in babies. There was also Taweret, a goddess depicted as part hippopotamus, part crocodile, part lion, who protected women in childbirth and young children afterward. So basically, if your baby wouldn't stop crying in ancient Egypt, your first move wasn't a checklist of, is the baby hungry, tired, or gassy? Your first move might have been checking whether your best statue needed repositioning. It's easy to look at this from a modern chair and laugh. And sure, go ahead, it's a little funny. But there's something surprisingly practical hiding underneath the mysticism. These rituals gave exhausted parents something to do. A crying baby with no obvious cause is one of the most helpless feeling situations a caregiver can face. Reciting a protective chant, placing an amulet, performing a small ritual, none of that stops the crying directly, but it gives the parent a sense of agency in an otherwise powerless moment. And a calmer, less panicked caregiver tends to be a more effective soother. So, in a roundabout way, praying to a hippo crocodile goddess might have actually helped, just not through the mechanism anyone at the time would have guessed. Of course, not every ancient culture reached for the supernatural first. Some went straight for the medicine cabinet, and this is where things get a little more alarming. Both ancient Egyptians and later the Romans were known to use preparations made from the opium poppy to calm fussy infants. There are historical references to poppy-based syrups and mixtures given to teething or colicky babies to help them settle. It worked in the sense that opium is a sedative, and will absolutely calm down a crying infant. It worked the way hitting the mute button works. The problem, obviously, is that dosing an infant with an opiate is wildly dangerous, and historical records suggest that infant deaths from these remedies were not exactly rare. This wasn't some fringe practice either. Sedating fussy babies with opium derivatives continued in various forms for centuries after antiquity, showing up again in things like soothing syrups, sold openly in the 1800s, well into an era that should have known better. So if you've ever wondered how far back the impulse to just knock a screaming baby out with something goes, the answer is uncomfortably far. Alongside opium, ancient and later traditional remedies for crying infants included things like chamomile, fennel, dill water, and various herbal concoctions believed to ease colic and stomach pain, which, to be fair, probably did help a little with actual digestive discomfort, since some of these plants have mild soothing properties even by modern standards. Honey was also commonly given to fussy babies in many ancient cultures, sometimes rubbed on a cloth or a finger for the baby to suck on. Modern pediatricians would have a collective heart attack at that idea today, since honey can contain botulism spores dangerous to infants under 1, but ancient parents obviously had no concept of infant botulism. They just knew honey was sweet, babies liked sweet, and sweet plus sucking equals temporary silence. Speaking of sucking, let's talk about pacifiers, because they're older than you'd think, just not in the plastic dishwasher-safe form we know today. Archaeologists and historians have found evidence of parents in various ancient and pre-modern cultures giving infants small cloth bundles containing honey, sugar, or bread soaked in milk, tied off and given to the baby to suck on. Essentially, a homemade sugar pacifier. It's crude. It's not remotely something a modern doctor would approve of, but the underlying instinct, give the baby something to suck on to calm down, is exactly the same instinct behind every modern pacifier sold today. Non-nutritive sucking, meaning sucking that isn't actually about feeding, has a real calming effect on infants, something modern research confirms, and ancient parents apparently figured out empirically, several thousand years before anyone had a word for non-nutritive sucking. Now let's talk about noise, because ancient parents also understood something else modern white noise machine companies charge $40 for. Babies like sound that mimics the womb. Inside the uterus, it's not actually quiet. It's a constant wash of muffled sound, the mother's heartbeat, blood flow, digestion, her voice resonating through tissue and fluid. It's less like silence and more like being inside a very warm, very rhythmic washing machine. So true silence, after birth, can feel unfamiliar and unsettling to a newborn. Ancient caregivers, again probably through observation rather than any understanding of prenatal acoustics, found that humming, chanting, rhythmic tapping, or singing could calm a crying infant. Which brings us to lullabies, one of the oldest and most universal human inventions, and one that predates written history by a wide margin. In fact, the oldest known lullaby in the world isn't some vague oral tradition we're guessing about. It survives on a clay tablet from ancient Babylon, dating back roughly 4,000 years, written in cuneiform. The lullaby is somewhat darkly about a baby's crying, disturbing a household god who then threatens the baby with various supernatural punishments if it doesn't quiet down. So, the very first lullaby we have physical evidence of is less hush little baby, don't say a word, and more hush little baby, or a deity is going to be extremely upset with you. Parenting through mild divine intimidation. Bold strategy, but hey, it got written down, so somebody thought it worked. Lullabies across virtually every culture on Earth share certain features: slow, repetitive rhythms, soft or descending melodic patterns, and simple, soothing sounds. This isn't coincidence. Musicologists and developmental researchers have found that these patterns mimic the rhythmic, repetitive qualities of a heartbeat and breathing, the same sensory environment a baby experienced for 9 months before birth. Ancient parents across wildly different civilizations, with no contact with one another, independently converged on strikingly similar musical solutions to the exact same problem. That's not magic. That's just what actually works on the human nervous system, discovered over and over again by exhausted people humming into the dark. Let's shift gears and talk about sleeping arrangements, because this is another area where ancient practice and modern practice diverge sharply, and understanding the difference explains a lot about crying, too. For the overwhelming majority of human history, co-sleeping wasn't a controversial parenting choice you'd read heated internet debates about. It was just how things were done. Families slept together, often in a single shared space, sometimes on shared bedding, with infants kept close to a parent's body throughout the night. Solo infant sleep, the practice of putting a baby down alone in a separate room, in a crib, behind a closed door, is a remarkably recent invention, really only becoming widespread in the last couple hundred years, and largely in wealthier Western societies with the space and resources to dedicate an entire separate room to a person who can't even hold up a spoon yet. From a crying baby standpoint, this matters a lot. A baby sleeping right next to a caregiver's body gets immediate response to the earliest, quietest signs of distress: a slight fuss, a stir, a change in breathing, long before it escalates into a full-blown scream. A baby sleeping alone in another room has to cry loud enough and long enough to be heard through walls and doors before anyone responds. So in some ways, ancient sleeping arrangements weren't just about warmth and practicality. They also functioned as an early warning system, catching distress before it became a crisis, which likely meant less prolonged, escalated crying overall. It's a lot easier to soothe a whimper than to talk down a full meltdown that's had 5 minutes to build up steam in an empty room. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now, I do have to mention that not every ancient society treated a crying infant with universal gentleness, because history is messy and complicated, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. In ancient Sparta, for example, infants were famously subjected to inspection shortly after birth, evaluated for physical strength and health, with the state playing an active and, by modern standards, deeply disturbing role in deciding which infants were considered fit to raise. This wasn't really about crying specifically, more about broader ideas of what made a viable future citizen soldier, but it's a stark reminder that ancient attitudes toward infants varied wildly depending on the values of the society in question. Not every culture treated a crying baby as a puzzle to solve gently. Some treated infancy itself as a kind of test. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got the Romans, who left behind actual written parenting advice, which is a goldmine for us because it means we don't have to guess what they were thinking. A physician named Soranus of Ephesus, writing around the 2nd century, produced detailed guidance on infant care, including advice on crying. And here's a fun twist. Some ancient advice sounds almost eerily similar to modern debates. Soranus cautioned against picking up a crying infant every single time it fussed, warning that constant indulgence could create a demanding, difficult temperament. Sound familiar? That's essentially the same argument people have today about spoiling a baby by responding too quickly, an argument modern pediatric research has largely pushed back against, by the way, since responsiveness to infant crying is generally linked to more secure attachment, not spoiled behavior. But the point is, this debate isn't new. Ancient Romans were out here arguing about attachment parenting versus tough love nearly 2,000 years before anyone had a parenting blog to do it on. Wealthier Roman households also commonly relied on wet nurses, women hired specifically to breastfeed, and often to help raise infants of families who could afford the arrangement. This meant that in a lot of upper class Roman homes, the person primarily responsible for soothing a crying baby, day in and day out, might not have been the biological mother at all. It was a professional caregiver, which, in its own strange way, mirrors modern arrangements with nannies and daycare providers. Turns out, outsourcing infant care isn't some shocking modern development. Rich people have been doing it since togas were fashionable. Let's also talk cradles and rocking devices because someone, somewhere, eventually got tired of holding a baby 24 hours a day and invented furniture to help. Rocking cradles show up across an enormous range of ancient and traditional cultures in various forms, from simple, hollowed logs to woven baskets suspended and swung to elaborate carved wooden designs in later periods. The specific materials differ by region and era, but the underlying idea is remarkably consistent. Suspend or balance the baby somewhere that allows continuous, gentle, low-effort rocking, freeing up the caregiver's arms and back while still delivering that critical womb-like motion. In various indigenous cultures across North America, cradle boards were used, rigid, portable frames that a baby would be securely wrapped and strapped into, allowing the infant to be carried on a caregiver's back, propped upright nearby during work, or even hung from a sturdy branch, rocking gently in the breeze while a parent tended to other tasks. This is basically an ancient multitasking device. Part safety seat, part soothing tool, part hands-free baby storage, and it kept infants close, secure, upright enough to observe the world, and gently rocked all at once. Different continents, different materials, wildly different cultures, and yet everyone kept arriving at the same basic engineering solution. Strap the baby somewhere secure, keep it moving, keep it close. Swaddling deserves its own mention here too, because it's one of the oldest and most consistently used infant soothing techniques in human history, showing up across nearly every ancient civilization we have records of, from Egypt to Rome to various regions of Asia and beyond. Wrapping an infant snugly in cloth restricts sudden limb movements, particularly the startle reflex that can jolt a sleeping or drowsy baby awake, and it recreates the snug, enclosed sensation of the womb. Some archaeological and artistic depictions of infants in various ancient cultures show them tightly wrapped, arms pinned at their sides, sometimes almost mummy-like in appearance, which looks a little unsettling to modern eyes, but functioned as an incredibly effective and low-tech soothing method that, in a modified and safer form, is still recommended by pediatricians today. So here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. When you line up all these ancient techniques, constant physical contact, motion, swaddling, rhythmic sound, communal caregiving support, and even sucking on something, they're not some scattered grab bag of primitive guesses. They map almost perfectly onto what modern pediatric researchers now understand as the most effective evidence-based methods for calming a crying infant. There's actually a well-known modern concept, popularized by pediatrician Harvey Karp, sometimes called the 5 S's. Swaddling, side or stomach positioning while held, shushing sounds, swinging or rocking motion, and sucking. Every single one of those 5 elements has a direct ancient equivalent that shows up independently, over and over across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, with zero contact or communication between them. That's not a coincidence. And it's honestly one of the more humbling things this kind of research reveals. It means ancient humans, without hospitals, without pediatricians, without a single peer-reviewed study, managed to figure out through generations of pure trial, error, and desperate 3 a.m. improvisation, essentially the same core toolkit that modern science eventually confirmed works. They didn't have the why. They didn't know about vestibular stimulation or the startle reflex or auditory womb mimicry, but they had the what hammered out the hard way, refined and passed down for tens of thousands of years, one exhausted parent teaching the next. And honestly, that's kind of the whole story here, isn't it? Strip away the demons, the amulets, the opium syrup nobody should have used, and the somewhat judgmental Roman physicians, and what you're left with is an unbroken thread running from a cave 60,000 years ago straight to your living room tonight. Someone, somewhere, is standing up right now, gently swaying side to side, humming something half remembered, holding a small, screaming human against their chest, hoping the movement and the warmth and the sound will do what they've always done. And it will, probably eventually, the same way it has for every single generation of humans that came before, all the way back to the very first mother who ever figured out that walking in slow circles beat standing still. You are, whether you realize it or not, performing a ritual that is genuinely as old as our species. The tools have changed. The understanding behind them hasn't. And somewhere in that fact, exhausting as 3 a.m. might feel, there's something almost comforting. You're not improvising alone. You're the latest link in an extremely long, extremely tired, extremely loving chain.